Welcome to your Route to Wellbeing podcast. I'm Sue Fullergood, and I'm absolutely sure that you deserve to feel great, and it's possible for you to pulse with energy. So if you're not thriving right now, or if there's something that's interrupting your thriving, then maybe this podcast is just what you're looking for. I've tapped into the knowledge base of experts in the 11 domains of well-being. Each of the experts has something that I think is part of the crucial knowledge that you need to be able to really take care of yourself. And so listen in and see if you can get that magical piece of information that's going to make the difference for you. Please feel free to share this with your friends and family, whoever you think may benefit from it. Please push the subscribe button so that you can be alerted when future episodes are available. Thank you for listening. So hello and good afternoon, and it really is a pleasure this afternoon to have some time with Colin Adam, who is from Adfen International and who is one of the people who taught me a lot about the Enneagram and taught me in a way that made me think about it in a very compassionate and people-centered kind of a way. So thank you, Colin, for all that you taught me. And I'm so glad now that my listeners can have a chance to really take advantage of your insight and your wisdom and see how they can use what you have to share regards building their own well-being in their own lives and getting to know themselves better, so that they can find the way within themselves to create well-being. So it really is a pleasure. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to this time together.
Thanks, Sue. It's great to be here. Great to see you again.
Thank you. Well, shall I kick off with the first question I'd love to ask you to try and answer is, can you explain the Enneagram and the benefits of understanding your Enneagram profile to the listeners? Some of them may not have even heard of the Enneagram before. They may not know what it's all about. And so can you give us a basic understanding of it and then what the benefits are?
Yeah, I'll try to do that. It's quite a complex model, I think, as you know, Sue. So I'll try to be as succinct as I can and just kind of give a flavor of the whole thing. So it's essentially the way we use it in terms of people development. It is a model of human behavior. That's the first thing. And it's a very accurate model of human behavior. It doesn't just describe patterns of behavior or how we show up in the world, but it also gives an indication of the reason underneath that. How is it that we behave this way? How is it that we have these kind of repetitive patterns of behavior, that others can start to recognize? I mean, we talk about people having a certain kind of personality. What we notice about them are their patterns, the patterns of behavior. So the Enneagram certainly describes that really well. And it gives an indication as to the underlying drivers of behavior, as well as being a kind of a map and a model of human behavior. It's also a kind of a process as well. So it's a dynamic model. By that I mean it implies some movement in the model. So when we relate that to ourselves, if you think about yourself, you don't always behave the same way. In certain contexts, you'll show up in a certain way, change the context, and you'll behave a little bit differently. So our behavior adapts to our context. And our context is our external environment that we find ourselves in, but it's also our internal one. I know your focus here is well-being and things like our health, whether we're feeling healthy, whether we're feeling stressed or not, and all kinds of other things that are going on internally can affect our external behavior. So the Enneagram, to a certain extent, predicts how we might show up in different contexts, particularly when we're showing up at our best and when we're kind of at our less than best, or perhaps when we're more stressed. It gives an indication of what to expect. So it's a useful model in that perspective. It's quite predictive in that way. The word Enneagram itself, if you divide it into the two sections, the word Ennea is a Greek word. It's derived from a Greek word, ennea, which means the number 9. And the word gram is also derived from a Greek word that refers to a picture of. So it's in words like diagram and anagram. So it's really kind of a picture of 9 is what the word means. So there are 9 aspects to this model, essential principal aspects to the model. And these are 9, some people refer to them as types, behavioral types or personality types. I tend to refer to them as behavioral patterns or styles. The word type for me feels a bit stuck in one place. Whereas we know if we observe ourselves, we flex our behavior, we adjust our behavior. So it feels a little looser than a kind of a tight sort of type. But we're talking the same kind of language. There are 9 principal patterns of behavior here that, in my worldview, seem to cover all aspects of human behavior. I really think that, you can map any kind of pattern into this model, from the most effective to the least effective, and even right down into pathologies. We've trained psychologists in the use of our process, the 5-lens Enneagram, and they're quite interested more in the sort of less effective end, if you like, the pathology end very often. So for me, it seems to encapsulate all human behavior, from the very best to the very kind of worst and most destructive. So it is quite helpful in that regard. The Enneagram can also be useful to us, not just in terms of a theoretical model, but once we start to see ourselves in it, and we start to see our own predominant patterns of behavior, we start to dig a little bit deeper. So it's a little bit like you can think of it more like a mirror, mirroring back to us how we kind of probably show up in the world. And some parts of that mirror we're going to recognize immediately. There is a degree of self-awareness for most people, pretty much everybody. But there's probably parts of that mirroring back that we don't immediately recognize, that is potentially in that realm of, I don't know what I don't know. I've not noticed that part of myself previously. And that's where often growth and opportunity lie. And it's a little bit like Johari's window. Sometimes other people notice things about me that I'm totally unaware of. And that's the benefit of feedback. And I think the model can really help with that. If we can start to position ourselves in the Enneagram and understand our prominent behavior, there's usually a principal center of our behavioral pattern. One of these 9 styles kind of is like home base that we drift back to when we're particularly less conscious, and it's very present for us. If we can understand what that is and start to dig a little bit deeper into it, we learn a lot more about ourselves. So for me, one of the greatest things about the Enneagram is this increasing self-awareness, self-insight. And the more aware we are of ourselves, the more we can adjust our behavior. If I'm not aware of what I'm doing, then I can't change it, can't adjust it, can't do more of it or less of it. But if I become aware of it, I can be intentional. So for me, one of the greatest things about the Enneagram is this sort of ability to deepen awareness, deepen self-insight, but also insight into other people, as well. So that's a little bit about the model.
Thank you for that very eloquent description. And I think that is what I love the most about the Enneagram, and helping people to understand their natural patterns or their natural styles, is that it gives you choices, and you don't then have to always show up the way you would if you were unconscious, but you actually could choose a different response in any given moment. And that freedom and sort of opportunity really sort of attracts me to the model, and certainly the more self-awareness you have, and the more awareness you have of your blind spots, the more choices you have to not just do what you automatically do.
Absolutely.
So Colin, you do work mostly with the 5-lens program, which is the one that you taught me. Can you share with us a little bit about the 5-lens program, and also the specific benefits of that particular way of engaging with the Enneagram?
Yeah. So the 5-lens is really, the name kind of gives something away about it. It's really looking at the individual from 5 different positions. It's almost like 5 photographs of an individual from different angles. And we're trying to kind of shed light on the individual so that they can start to uncover some of the blind spots, but also reveal some of the strengths. Some of those blind spots in there are hidden strengths as well. So it's useful to understand what our strengths are, because we need to use those. We need to access them. The resources that we already have. And there may be other areas that we want to adjust, to be intentional about our personal growth, or improving or change or adapt in certain ways, build new patterns of behavior. So it's useful from that perspective. But yeah, so the 5 lens is really 5, think of it as 5 photographs of an individual, and it can be used for groups as well, and teams, by the way. But let's stay with the individual just for now. But it's centered on the Enneagram. This is the important thing, that the constant thread that flows through the 5 lens is the Enneagram model itself. And the other 4 lenses are just trying to tease out certain aspects of the Enneagram and really emphasize them a little bit more. So it's quite a detailed, integrated picture that it produces. We use a questionnaire, for example. It's an online questionnaire that people can do, which is a 5 lens questionnaire, and it generates an individual feedback report, which is then debriefed with the individual. We walk them through it, as opposed to just leave them with a report, a written report. But the other 4 lenses, the first one is called personal mastery, which is literally about, how well are we showing up in the world? How effective are we at the moment? Are we showing up really well and effectively? Are there certain parts of our lives and our patterns that are less than effective in that sense? So it kind of shows up in that space. There are 6 factors in there, by the way, of personal mastery, which, if you want me to, I can go into a little bit later. We really unpack that. Sorry, Sue, you were going to say?
Yeah, no, I was going to say it'd be lovely if you would unpack those,
right.
But let's get the overview first, maybe.
Yeah, sure.
I think that's what you're going to do.
Yeah. So personal mastery is that kind of gives a sort of a sense of that. The second lens we refer to emotional resilience, which has a relationship to stress levels. So resilience is about our ability to cope with adversity, challenge, difficulty in our lives. So the more resilient we are, we tend to be able to cope fairly well with most things that life throws at us. It's not that we never get stressed. Of course, we will at high levels of resilience, but we're kind of moving through life fairly comfortably, generally, in a way. At the low levels of emotional resilience, it tends to be a different story. It tends to suggest that life is quite tough and hard and difficult and challenging, and I might even feel quite stuck in a particular space in my life, or with a particular problem that I'm experiencing that I haven't solved yet. So those are the 2 extremes, and it's graded. There's almost like a continuum, if you will, between the highest and lowest end of resilience. So there is a kind of an inverse relationship to stress here. So the lower our emotional resilience, the more our kind of ambient general experience will be quite stressful. The higher our resilience, the more comfortable we're going to feel, the more we take life in our stride, if you can sort of get that sort of context. It has a strong relationship to our levels of stress. Those first 2 lenses are really mission critical, because another word I wanted to introduce from an Enneagram perspective is this word integration. So within each of those 9 patterns of behavior that I mentioned earlier, we can operate at a really high level of effectiveness, where we're really coping with life well, we're adding great value, our relationships we're investing in, and just things are going really well in the highest levels. Or it can go right deeply down into the pathology end, which I mentioned before, which most people are not at that extreme, of course, but it's a ladder. So what we call a ladder of integration within each of the 9 styles. So we've tried to unpack what that looks like. What is integration? And these first 2 lenses, our level of, if you like, personal mastery, which relates to personal effectiveness, and our levels of stress and our experience of stress generally, tend to affect how well we're showing up within our Enneagram pattern. So it unpacks that sort of concept a little bit further. Then we look at something which is called social drives. That's the third lens, which is linked to 2 underpinning models, actually, one of which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which a lot of people will be familiar with. It's been around for a long time. But more recently, Richard Barrett worked with Maslow's model and extended it to 7 levels. 7 levels of consciousness, it's sometimes referred to. But it's based on current sort of needs that we have. There are 7 of these, but in the individual 5 lens reports, feedback reports, and processes that we have, we work with the first 4 of these. So we'll look at things like the drive to survive. You know, how well am I taking care of myself? We'll look at the drive to affiliate, which is around my close relationships. So when we're taking care of ourselves, we can pay more attention to closer relationships and contact in that sort of space. And then we got the social drive, which is more about a connection to a broader group. So it's almost like the peer group, if you will, and my reputation in that peer group and wanting to be seen as a valued member of that group and competent at what I do, etc. And then the next one that we look at moves into what Barrett refers to as the greater good. So it's not about self, this next level, it's more about contributing to something bigger than self. So it's not usually about looking at a return on the deal, so to speak, or return on the investment. It's not necessarily about a salary for doing things. It's a little bit more philanthropic, if you will. So it's about wanting to make a difference in the world, wanting to leave a legacy, to add value to a community or an environment of some kind. So it speaks more to broader purpose, if you will, rather than a specific kind of objective. So we kind of look at that, and often in personal development or coaching environments, the coaching theme often shows up in that sort of space, in one of those levels. So it kind of brings to fore there. The first 3 of those levels, by the way, relate to what some people refer to as the subtypes in the Enneagram. So the drive to survive, the drive to affiliate, the social drive are 3 kinds of orientations, if you will, of each of the 9 styles that can affect behavior to some extent. And we take that into consideration as well when we produce the Enneagram descriptions and the feedback reports. So that's the 3rd lens. The 4th one.
So just to quickly jump in there on that, would you say that at the end of the day, you want to have all of those in the sort of in balance? You want to have all of them showing up in your life. You don't want to have one dominating and one sort of being neglected. Is that?
I suppose in an ideal world that would be true. So the thing about those first 3 levels that I described, it's not about, so drive to survive, for example, it's thought of as the base model because, it's true for any species of animal. If you think about it, if individuals can't survive, the whole species dies out, essentially. So there is a bit of self-orientation here. That's where we kind of begin. And if I'm not looking after myself, then it's that much harder to manage my relationships, if you will, or to extend myself into the world. So it's the base kind of model. So it is important to have some self-care, not to sort of overdo it such that I become this hypochondriac, for example. So to have it as a insensible self-care, where it makes sense that I'm taking care of myself, I'm looking after my health, I'm looking after my financial health, maybe, just making sure that I'm balancing my books at the end of the month, paying my bills and, not getting too much in debt, for example. And also just making sure that I'm safe and secure, and if I'm moving into an unsafe space, that I'm aware of it and I can take precautions. So that idea of self-care is there. You don't want to kind of overdo it because you can become a little bit obsessed in that space. You don't want to underdo it either because it means that I'm self-neglecting, in a way, and maybe putting myself at risk. So there's an equilibrium here. There's a sort of a balance that probably is what we need to find. So yeah, we need to find balance in these 3, but not to sort of think that, well, I've done the self-care bit now, I can move on to relationships. It's a sort of transcend and include. So I've always got to pay some attention to myself. If I fall over sick or ill or something happens to me, then I can't be a contribution to others, in a way. That's why it's kind of the foundational part of this model. So I've always got to be aware of my taking care of me. then I can start to extend myself into closer relationships, for example, and pay attention to that. So I offer support to others, for example, but it's also a support group for me. So it's a kind of a symbiotic kind of relationship. So our inner circle, so to speak, it's the kind of important people in our lives. So family would be in there, close friends or colleagues, that sort of thing, and paying attention to those relationships. And then the broader social group, to be seen, to be kind of competent, connecting into a broader kind of community, if you will, in that sort of space, and making a contribution there as well. So it's to deal with your question, it's probably about balance. It is about balance and to find an equilibrium there. But these things will shift around. It depends on our context again. So things can happen to us in life that like illness can happen to people. So if I suddenly discover that I've got something quite severely wrong health-wise, my drive to survive is going to be elevated quite correctly. I need to start paying particular attention to that, more attention to self in a way. Or if something happens in one of my close relationships, maybe I have a big conflict with my boss, at work, and that's an important figure in my life. That's going to push a higher score in the affiliation level. So it means that it's quite appropriate to do that, because it kind of alerts me to, I need to take care of that. I need to kind of fix that in some way. So depending on what's happening to us again, it can go out of balance, but quite appropriately so. Sometimes we do need to pay more attention to one of these areas than others. And even life stage can affect these things. If somebody is approaching retirement, for example, they might be concerned about their financial well-being or even health issues. So that you might see a slightly more elevated drive to survive there at that point in time. So the context affects behavior, and it's an important part of this whole process as well. We don't just behave in a vacuum. We're affected by our external circumstances and our internal environment as well. Our health, our stress levels, our thinking, feeling kind of aspects as well. So context is really mission critical when we're looking at the 5 lens. Does that make sense, Sue?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And, I want you to finish going through the 5 lenses, but I just do want to interject, just because, when I did my 5 lens training with you, it was many years after I'd started working with the Enneagram. And part of doing it, you guys did another Enneagram test with me. And when I got my results, it was very clear, and you did my debrief for me. Thank you. And it clearly pointed out that I wasn't paying enough attention to self-preservation, that the drive to self-preserve was very low. And you clearly said to me, this isn't a good idea and it's not sustainable. But I didn't really put it as a priority to do anything about it. And I subsequently had numerous life events which have really brought self-preservation into the front of my mind and changed that. And I so often think about how I had the insight, and I could have maybe, who knows, prevented some of these things from happening had I been more alerted by the debrief. So from my own personal experience, having that insight and that information of what is in your blind spot and what you're not aware of can often give you the tools and the insight to be able to change it. And I've just written a book on the sweet spot. So everybody in my community is very used to hearing about this balanced middle ground place where it's not too extreme on either side. So I love the way you said it's about finding not too much self-care, not too much self-preservation, but just the right amount, or any one of the other drivers. So thank you. I love the way you've explained that. And then do you want to carry on and share with us what the other lenses are?
Yeah, so
number 3.
Yeah, that was number 3. So the 4th one is what we call the energy centers, and there are 3 of them. And this is it gives a high-level view on the Enneagram model. Actually, there are 3 so-called centers to this model, and these 3 centers, or we've referred to them in our approach as the energy centers. You could also think of them as 3 kinds of intelligence that we have. So the 5 lens is not an intelligence test by any means. but it kind of shows us what do we tend to rely on when we're making life decisions or big decisions in our life. How do we do that? How do we go about that? And these are three kinds of intelligence that we can draw on if we're aware of it. Very often you find that individuals are kind of overbalanced in one of these three. In other words, they might be prone to overutilizing one of the three, or underutilizing, one of the others, for example. But if we're really conscious about these two, and I'll describe them to you just now, we can start to think about, well, given this decision that I've got to make, or this choice that I've got to make, what do I need to tap into? What do I need to go into? What do I need to refer to as a reference point to help me make this life choice? So these are three kinds of intelligence that if we're aware of them, we can tap into. So at a certain level, we are aware of them, but it's being aware in that moment when we have to make those choices. That's the key thing, to remember them there. So one of these things is it's sometimes called the head center. So in our model, we call it the intellectual center. So people who are dominant in that space are kind of overbalanced in that space. It's not to say, by the way, that they are more intellectual or cleverer, or brighter people. It's just that the locus of control in decision-making tends to be in the logic and the rationale and the analytical side of things. So they will tend to gather data. That will be their natural tendency. So if I'm going to buy a car and there are two options, how am I going to make that choice? Well, if I was in this particular center, then I might gather data, find out about option A as much as possible, find out about option B, compare and contrast, pros and cons, a bit of an analysis, and make a logical, rational choice. And there's benefit in that. And in fact, business likes to operate that way, doesn't it? Strategic planning starts with very often a so-called SWOT analysis, which is really pulling data in, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Let's understand the playing field. And then let's make some logical choices about how we move forward from this place. So, and there is value in it when it plays out in the right context. But in certain contexts, it's less effective. So one of the things about the head center is that it requires time. You need time to gather the data. You need time to analyze it and do the thinking around it and choose the rational, logical choice. Sometimes in life, we don't have that luxury, and we need to make a decision in the moment. Otherwise, we've lost the opportunity. We're not going to get that opportunity again. So we have to rely on something else. And one of those aspects could be what we've referred to as the instinctual center. Sometimes it's referred to as the gut center of the Enneagram, or the body center of the Enneagram. And it's in our everyday language, isn't it? Our gut feel. That's what we're sort of referring to here. And it's that intuitive sense. And I think the word intuition is a good one here. It's like, if you meet somebody for the very first time in a social environment, you might quickly, and you know nothing about them, so there's no data, you might quickly feel, this doesn't feel right. I've got to be a bit guarded here. There's something not right. So it's kind of our gut is talking to us in a sense. Or the opposite, that you feel, I can really open with this person. I can trust them quickly. I feel comfortable. And yet the data is very minimal. So it's kind of an instinctual sort of response to somebody or some event. And interestingly, the neurosciences in the recent years have found that there is brain activity, electrical activity that happens in the lower gut area that is pretty much identical to brain activity that happens in our heads. And they've started to refer to the lower gut as the second brain. You're probably aware of that, I think, Sue. And I saw a paper a while back, which it's speculative, but this person was suggesting that possibly that's where intuition comes from, because all of the data, if you will, that goes through to our logical brain, our brain, comes through our five senses, our body. We touch it, see it, smell it, hear it, taste it. And if the body is starting to process some of that data before we're really conscious of it, maybe that is what intuition is about, that gut instinct, in a way. So
we call it bottom-up information as opposed to top-down. Yeah. And we always think it's coming from here downwards into the body, but it's actually, they say 80% of it going the other way.
Yeah. And I noticed more recently, like in leadership development, this kind of intuitive aspect is coming into the fore in leadership development a lot more, trying to get leaders to tune into that a little more. And I think possibly because the world is so rapidly changing. I mean, things happen that are unexpected, all the time. Look at COVID. Beginning of 2020,
Absolutely.
everything was fine. By March, the whole world had closed down, and people are working from home, and it's turmoil. And then we got to adapt quickly, in that context. And so there are occasions where that instinct, if we can tap into it in leadership and self-leadership as well. I'm not just speaking about corporate or team leadership, but self-leadership as well, where if we can tap into it, it's helpful, particularly in rapidly changing environments. It's useful. So that's the second one. The third one is what we call the emotional center. So it links to emotional intelligence. So people who are kind of inclined in that way tend to be a little more in touch with their own emotions. It's almost like they got the language of emotion. If you ask them how they feel, they can name it quite quickly. They know how they're feeling. So they've got a sense of their emotional landscape, if you will. And I think because of that, they can start to read it in other people. So somebody might walk into the office in the morning and you just know something's wrong. Something's happened. And they've not even said a word yet. And it's this tuning into the subtle cues that give an indication of a person's emotionality. And the great benefit there, of course, is connecting with people, making decisions about how we connect with people and when we connect with them, how we communicate with them. So if I know that you're upset or something's disturbed your world and I've got some tough feedback to give you, maybe the timing isn't right. Maybe I need to offer some compassion and support as opposed to tough feedback at that point in time. So we can adjust our behavior towards other people in relationships. So the EQ is helpful in that space, the emotional intelligence, if you will. So if we can,
but we really need all of those, right? I mean, ideally, if we could make a decision using all three and engage with everything we're doing using all three, we would be much more powerful in the world.
Absolutely. And in fact, there are some people who work with the Enneagram just with these three centers, getting an individual to try and balance those three or be aware of them and choose the correct one at the point in time. I mentioned the Enneagram earlier on. There's 9 styles. If you look at the actual model, I don't have an image of it. Maybe I should have brought one. But
I can get one if we want.
There are 3 styles in each of these 3 centers, which make up the so whatever your prominent, your dominant, your kind of default Enneagram style is, and there will be one of them that is a home base that drift back to that we're very familiar with. It will lie in one of these 3 centers. So it kind of gives an indication of which of these 3 centers is likely to be sort of more prominent, we're more inclined that way, very often. So so those are the 4, and then the 5th model is the Enneagram. But the first 4 really, they sort of shine a light on the Enneagram and give an idea of a little bit more than just the dominant style. It kind of unpacks it and teases out various aspects of it. And with our approach, we try to individualize. That is, if we're talking about the assessment, we individualize it as much as possible. So it's not like 2 people who happen to be dominant in Enneagram 5, for example, are probably not going to get the same description in their feedback reports because they've got different levels of stress or emotional resilience, different levels of personal mastery, etc., etc. And so we, as much as possible, try to tailor it. Yeah, that's a great little image there.
Is it in the middle of the screen? I can't see what you can see.
It's not quite. If you can you enlarge it a little? Maybe.
There we go. Yeah, there we go. Is that better?
Yeah, that's
Can you see it more clearly now? Yeah.
Yeah, spot on. So if you look at that, it doesn't actually depict the 3 centers, but if you look at the styles at the top, the 8, 9, and 1, that forms what we call the instinctual center, sometimes called the gut center or the body center of the Enneagram. So those styles tend to be more a little bit more in touch with that instinctual aspect, the gut feel, if you will. The 2, 3, and 4 on the right-hand side tend to be more inclined towards the emotional. Well, that is the emotional center. They comprise the emotional center. and then the 5, 6, and 7 tend to be more in the intellectual or head center of the Enneagram, sometimes referred to as head, heart, and gut, by the way. Head being the 5, 6, 7, heart being the 2, 3, 4, and the gut the 8, 9, 1. And those odd lines in the middle of this thing connecting the different styles, that talks to the dynamic nature of this. There is movement in this model, so we tend to move around these lines a little bit depending upon our context. Not that we change our primary style, but we can sometimes take on some of the characteristics of a different style within the model. So it's a dynamic model, far more than a typology, I think, in a way. It's a process mapping. Yeah.
I find it so interesting with these head, heart, and gut centers, that people so often with their own body language talk about it. The heart-centered people often explain things with their hand on their heart, and I think they often manifest problems in their body in those centers that are either underactive. It's almost like the body's trying to call awareness and attention to that attended to center. Or otherwise they, if they're overusing, for example, the head center, they might come with headaches, or and I mean, I'm a head-centered type, and if I'm getting over enthusiastic about everything and over driven and too much in my head, I'll get headaches, or I notice my eyes don't work properly or whatever. So I think it really is interesting how the body speaks this as well.
It is. In fact, over time, and it's probably close to 13,000 people now that have actually gone through the 5 lens, approach. And now over time, you start to notice patterns, and there's no sort of statistical evidence of this, but this is anecdotal, what I'm going to describe to you now. It kind of links into what you just said. We do notice that there seems to be a propensity for certain health issues associated with some of these Enneagram styles. It kind of just shows up every now and then, and it seems to be hovering around one of these Enneagram styles. So I think there are some health associations here. It's almost like the mind-body connection, that I think you're trying to describe there. I think that is true, strangely enough. And I think it talks to this model being a pretty holistic model. It's an integrated model. It's not just I wouldn't just call it a sort of the way we think, or the way we feel. It is that, but it's also the way we behave and how our relationship to our bodies and our relationship to the world in general. There's a lot of depth to the model. Yeah. Just one point on this, that you'll see these 9 styles are numbered 1 through 9. It doesn't imply that 1 is the best or 9 is the worst, or, in that sense. None of these styles is better or worse than any other. All can be incredibly good, and effective in the world in various contexts, and all can be diabolically bad, at the other end when we're not playing out so well. So there's no better thans here. It just represents diversity, actually, different ways of looking at the world and feeling and experiencing the world and interpreting the world. And it's a model of diversity if you want to apply it to a group of people, in a sense.
And it's so beautiful that you can so clearly see how different people are. And, I think that's really, really important as we engage with people in the world, that we don't expect everybody else to be like us, or we're mindful of the fact that everybody else isn't seeing the world through the same lens that we are. And so I think, that's the huge value that this model has to offer.
Yeah. I think each of these styles notice different things in the environment. They paid particular attention to certain aspects of the external world, and therefore interpret the external world slightly differently. So this is why you can get 2 people witnessing the same car accident or crime, or something happened, and they will tell different stories, about what happened, even though they were both eyewitnesses to the event, because they're paying attention to different parts of it. And this is the beauty of diversity, that if we could bring different views together without being judgmental and critical, but seeing it as all part of the whole, we might get closer to the actual truth, rather than holding on to our view and telling the other person that they're wrong. And this is how conflict starts to happen, of course. This is why nations go to war with each other, ultimately, that it's about right and wrong. So we start throwing rocks at each other, metaphorically, and that's what damages relationships at the end of the day. But if we can operate at a higher level of integration, as it were, higher level of personal mastery and emotional resilience, and we can be a little bit less critical of others, but more open, and some humility about our perspective. And if we could combine these things, these different views, instead of holding on to our view of the world for dear life, maybe we'd have less conflict in the world and in teams and organizations.
If only. And we definitely have better well-being. Definitely have better well-being. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah. Thank you, Colin. And then, so you got to number 4, and then the 5th lens, of course, is the Enneagram.
It is.
Yeah.
Do you want me to say a little bit more about it, Sue?
If you'd like. I mean, is there more that you would like to share?
Well, I mean, there are 9 styles there. Maybe I think
that would be great to go through each of the 9 styles just very quickly, and
okay.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really think you highlighted, and you certainly highlighted it when we did our training, is that your default strategy, if you like, in the world is not set in stone. So once you understand that this is how you naturally behave, you can choose to draw on the other Enneagram styles, and that you're not stuck in a box. Because lots of people say to me, I don't want to do the Enneagram because I don't want to be stuck in a box. But I think, the way that you certainly see it, and I see it the same way, is that this is a route out of a box. Because when you don't know, you're stuck in the box because you have no choices. But once you do, you could choose to pull on some of the other things. So invitation to the listeners when you're hearing about the different Enneagram styles is to really remember that you have all of these available to yourself to a greater or lesser extent. And so don't think, oh, that's not me. Yes, it is you. It might only be a little bit of you, but you could choose to bring it up if you wanted to in the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you can think of these as 9 sets of resources that we all have. So we're not just one of these numbers or styles. In fact, you'll find that if you kind of really self-observe, there'll be times when you'll notice behaviors across all 9 patterns here. There are some that you're going to use more frequently that are going to be more habitual and you're more familiar with, but you do tend to use behaviors from these other styles as well. Just to kind of quickly run through it, bearing in mind that each of these styles has a lot of depth to each one, and you could spend a whole day just unpacking one of these styles, but just to maybe touch on each of them. One of the useful ways, I think, to try and understand the model is to start with the underlying driver. So the thing that we are, that drives our behavior. And it's often I know this sounds a little bit negative, but it's a fundamental fear that we tend to have, what we tend to call in our model an area of avoidance, something that we learned very early on in our lives as children, that it was kind of unpleasant, this thing, whatever it is. And therefore we developed a sort of pattern of behavior that kept us away from that thing or entity that we felt uncomfortable with. And because that became habitual, it starts to get ingrained. So just to go through the sequence, the Enneagram 1 tends to avoid criticism. So if you're going to avoid criticism, what's a great strategy? Well, perhaps to be perfect, to be 100% in everything that I do, because then you can't really criticize me. So this is the type of person that aims for very high standards, strong work ethic, doing things correctly, making sure every I is dotted, T's crossed. So a little bit of, if you like, perfectionism. Sometimes people refer to this as the perfectionist. It's one way to kind of look at it. The word there is reformer. And that's, on the positive side here, these are individuals that really try to change the world for the better. So they notice what's wrong in the world and they want to improve it. So they want to improve things, to raise the level, raise the standard. So they're often referred to as reformers. And when they're at their best, that's what they do. They make a massive difference in the world and improve things. The Enneagram 2s tend to avoid interestingly enough, their own needs. So that drive to survive, one might recall, they tend to be, it's not unusual for them anyway, to be quite low on the drive to survive because they don't focus there. And instead of that, they focus on other people's needs. So they're helpers, they are supporters, they are generous supporters of other people. They're focused on enabling others to be the best that they can be. So you'll find them in helping professions, for example. They're kind of drawn into that sort of space. But generally, at their best, warm, generous individuals. And they're at their best when that offer of help is unconditional. It's not that they want something back, you know, on the deal. But when it's unconditional giving, it tends to be phenomenal. But they do need to learn to take care of themselves as well. Drive to achieve, the achiever, number 3. These are people that tend to avoid failure. Failure is the big thing here. So the counterbalance to that is to focus on success and achievement and achieving goals and, you know, hitting targets and doing well in that sort of space. So that's the achiever. They kind of a tendency to overdo it. And so the kind of idea of the workaholic, you know, that's when they get out of balance, when work becomes absolutely everything. And sometimes relationships can take a back seat in that space. So that's the achiever in another way, but at their best, they get the balance right. So yeah, achieving is important, helping others to achieve as well, but also managing relationships in an authentic way is helpful here as well. The individualist, the avoidance here is, the word that I tend to use is meaninglessness, things without meaning, which implies that the counterbalance is go for depth, go for meaning, go for purpose, go for deeply understanding things. So they're often drawn to things like philosophy and deeper conversations with people as opposed to casual, light conversations. So they really want to get to know others in a deep way. So often very creative as well. Often you will find them quite often as artists or creative, or even not, if it's not art, it could be entrepreneurial, starting businesses, but creating something. They often feel a little different from other people. They feel like, the word there is individualist, they feel a little bit separate from others, and the need to connect and the need to create is very powerful there. They bring beautiful things into the world. The Enneagram 5, here it's called the investigator, quite an introverted style. This is your analyst, your data collector. They tend to be a little bit avoidant of the social space. So it can get a little uncomfortable in a social environment. And so they can be a little bit more withdrawn, but they focus on data and information and analysis quite a lot, often great observers of the world. Noticing what goes on. They can bring great insight and wisdom if we can remember to bring that voice in. But sometimes because they're a little bit more introverted, they don't automatically bring that voice in. So we've got to remember to invite them in and create space for that. But pockets of wisdom very often in teams and organizations and families. The Enneagram 6, the avoidance there, it tends to be related to risk or danger situations. So there's some caution here. So they tend to look at the world and notice what could go wrong or where the risk and dangers could be. And they attempt to keep themselves and other people safe. So they will try to navigate around areas that are risky or dangerous, or put contingency plans into place that tend to keep themselves and others safe. So this is not an independent style so much. Great team players, great in sort of relationships, very relational style, but it's about keeping self and others safe. Not to the extent of over caution and not doing anything, but being sensibly cautious about things and moving forward. So they create a lot of safety in the world, and a lot of courage here as well, by the way. This is the style that understands risk and danger and fear. And when they don't allow that to stop them and they still move through the problem, I think that's probably where courage lies in the Enneagram. The 7, they tend to avoid the word is pain, really, I suppose, emotional pain particularly. And so rather than dwelling on pain, they tend to do the opposite. They dwell on the positive things, the optimistic things, the visions of the future, the possibilities that the future could hold. And they're often visionaries. They can paint a great picture of the future. This is more extroverted space, so they can communicate their positive view of the future to others and rally others around a vision. They're often visionary type leaders, if you wanted to position it into a leadership space. They sometimes need to slow down a little bit. They can be sort of very fast-paced individuals. So sometimes if they're not careful, they can leave people behind because they move forward so quickly. So you've got to remember to move with people if they're part of a team. They're probably a little bit more of a risk taker, certainly more than the Enneagram 6. And so they're willing to take calculated risks. So you often find them as entrepreneurs, starting businesses, in that kind of environment. Enneagram 8 tends to avoid, the word is vulnerability, being seen to be weak or vulnerable in some way. So they tend to show up in a more assertive way, a stronger way. They present a strong image to the world. Sometimes they overdo it, and it can feel a bit intimidating if they overuse that sort of power that they've got, personal power. But when they start to use that influence in service of others and the world in general, it can be really an incredible influence. It can turn into what I would think of as the servant leader, in the world. Very, very strong leader, very assertive leader, but it doesn't feel dangerous to others. It feels supportive, and it feels like it's for the benefit of everybody. So it's not damaging in that regard at their best. Then you got the final one there, the 9. Again, you can see it's often referred to as the peacemaker. These are individuals that, if you read a lot of the books, you'll probably find that they refer to the avoidance of conflict here for the Enneagram 9, which is not untrue. But I think underneath that, I think you've got to ask the question, well, what is it about conflict that's such an issue for the Enneagram 9? Well, I think the issue is about the loss of relationship or the damage to relationships. So conflict can cause damage to relationships. It can sever relationships and leave an individual feeling abandoned and isolated and alone. So this is the person that avoids that, and that is why conflict is an issue. So this is a person who's relationally orientated. They want to maintain relationships. Harmony and peace are the important things here. This is one of the great things that they bring into the world. And if you look at the world at the moment, we need peace. There's a lot of turmoil and aggression in the world, in families even, in communities, in nations. So we need peace, and this is a great attribute that they bring. So they're almost naturally diplomatic. They can help others resolve conflicts. They're non-judgmental, so they tend not to take sides. I think it's metaphoric that it's over the center of this circle. It's the only one that's over the center of the circle in the sort of balance point between left and right or east and west. And it kind of implies that access to both without being biased one way or the other. And I think that's one of the great gifts there. That's how they bring peace. They are able to help others find common ground, and do it calmly, in a way. So they bring peace into the world. So that's very, very quickly a little tour of that.
Remarkable. I love how you've done that, Jeeves. You are extremely able to do that in a short space of time. So thank you for that. And I'm just thinking, in a way, if you could understand yourself and your natural strategy, then it's so clear that would help you in the world, that would help you in your life, because it's almost like coming home, seeing how you tend to want to behave and how you do behave, and understanding it within the context of what you might be unconsciously trying to avoid. And maybe take that one step further, understanding that the essence quality that's sitting inside of you is the thing that you're bringing to the world, and that enables you to be more fully who you were born to be, I think. So can you talk a little bit to that, Colin?
Yeah, no, I can. And I think it relates to what you were saying earlier about being in a box, being stuck in a box, this is why I kind of, it's a personal thing, and it's not critical of other people that use this sort of language, but I tend to not use the word type, because again, it feels like, my feet are stuck in concrete and I kind of can't move. I'm stuck in this kind of space. And for me, that feels too limiting in a way, sort of language. That's why I like elusive feel, like style or behavioral pattern. It's like, today I'm kind of wearing a gray shirt. Tomorrow I might be wearing a blue shirt, but I'm the same person, but I'm just adjusting my look and feel, as it were, my pattern of behavior in a sense. So we can adjust. We're not just one of these numbers. I think that's important. Certainly one of them will be our dominance, our primary style, no question about that. But there is more to us than that. And I often think of this model, I know it's always represented like this as a flat model, circular model, two-dimensional. But if you could imagine it as a cone, so the circle that you can see there is the base of a cone that actually comes out of the screen to a point, like these cones they put in the road when they're doing kind of road works kind of thing. For me, that's not a bad representation, because no matter where I start, no matter what my primary style is, if it happens to be 3, for example, as I start to integrate, in other words, my personal mastery increases, that's lens 1 in our 5-lens model, and my emotional resilience starts to increase. Those two things combine to enhance our level of integration. So as we do that, if Enneagram 3 is my starting point, as I start to integrate, it's like moving up the side of the cone, if you can imagine that. So it's coming out of the screen, but as I come out of the screen, I'm moving more over the center of the model. So it's making me a little bit more equidistant to these other styles, which I'm using metaphor here, obviously, but it kind of, I'm less anchored, I'm less stuck in that 3-ness. It's always going to be there, but I've now got a little bit more access to these other styles. I'm closer to them somehow. So you find that at higher levels of integration, it's less easy, I think, to spot a person's primary Enneagram style, because they're more flexible. They're not as stuck in that box doing the same thing over and over again, that pattern of behavior that happens to be 3-ness in the example I've used. When they're constantly doing that 3-ness, it's very easy to spot it, because that's what they're doing much of the time. But as they start to integrate and they start to incorporate some other aspects of this model into their repertoire of behaviors appropriately, depending upon the context, and very often intentionally. So our levels of consciousness have improved, our intentionality is improved. There's more choice. I think you used that word earlier, Sue. I'm not as unconscious. I'm not as reactive. I'm choosing behavior appropriately for the context that I'm in. Then it's less easy to spot my primary style. And I think that's often the case at high levels of integration. So with integration, for me, comes more flexibility, more intentionality, more awareness, more consciousness of self, more awareness of others as well. And you used the word compassion earlier as well. And that's a great word for me, in my worldview as well, about this model. It allows me to be compassionate, first of all, for me, about myself. I can look at myself, warts and all, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly, and kind of be okay with that, and be compassionate with myself and gentle with myself around it. And that enables me to do the same for other people, without necessarily judging them or condemning them or poking fun at them. We've all got our fragilities, we've all got our strengths. And if we can just be with them, as opposed to, turn away from them or push them away, or incorporate them into our way of being. In fact, one of our first factor in personal mastery is called self-acceptance. Can I accept that, yeah, I've got some strengths, I've got some things that I'm not very good at as well, by the way, and can I just be okay with that and make some choices around it? And I might choose to work on certain things and not on others, but be intentional, as opposed to judgmental and hyper self-critical and not wanting to look at myself in that regard, that sort of thing. So for me, that's what happens at high levels of integration. We are more compassionate. We are towards self and others. We're more intentional. We're more conscious. We can make good choices, better choices for ourselves and choose how we respond to other people in a more appropriate way. That's how I would
Yeah,
say.
thank you. Thank you for that, Colin. And one of the things that I think underpins well-being is that we're able to unashamedly be who we really are in the world and live our own truth. And I think when we can bring that self-acceptance and self-awareness without judgment to ourselves, then it enables us to not try and be like everybody else, or not try and show up as a shapeshifter trying to be as people expect us to be, but rather to actually delve inside and find the golden Buddha that lies inside, that it sort of is constructed of all our magnificent strengths and weaknesses, and be that in the world, which I think is so much less effortful and therefore enables us to find better well-being, because we're not wasting all our precious life energy trying to show up in a certain way or hide away our certain selves, but actually I think this gives us some sort of a route map to being able to show up as we truly are. And
some people refer to it as almost a journey home, that we've got to do. So it's almost as if we come into the world as a soul, as a consciousness, in a way, and a sort of a pure consciousness. We haven't interacted with the world yet, but over time we do interact, and there is a kind of a process there where the ego starts to form. We first get identified with our physical bodies as an infant, and then we start to see ourselves as a separate entity, rather than just part of this amorphous whole kind of thing. And that gets reinforced even further through various experiences that we have. And the ego starts to form, and we get this self-identity of who we think we are. And we start to show up in a certain context. We learn from our family, from the culture that we're in, from societal norms, from our socialization, our education, about how we're meant to behave. And we kind of absorb that in. And we slowly move away from who we really are and into this individual who's kind of manufactured this sense of self-identity, if you get what I'm saying. And then we start to portray that, in the world. And there are times when that works, and there will be some strengths in that, but there'll be times when it doesn't work. But it's a kind of again, some people refer to it as the false self. It's the manufactured self. It's not that essence that we came into the world with, and we've kind of lost touch with that in a way. And I think part of the journey, some people have described it this way, is to almost de-layer, take all these layers off that we've put into place, we've manufactured in a way. And what about getting back to that true essence, who we really are, how we were meant to be in the world, kind of thing. Remember one person describing it like a light bulb, and over time, a layer of paint goes over the light bulb, and then maybe another layer of paint and another layer of paint, and that light gets dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. Who we really are, we show less and less to the world. And it's almost like we've got to strip layer by layer off the paint, off this thing to get back to our real essence, who we really are, who we were meant to be in the world, as opposed to this manufactured self because society kind of tells us that's how we're meant to be, sort of thing.
Absolutely. I always say we spend the first 18 years of our lives being programmed into a way of being, and then we have to spend the rest of our lives trying to unprogram ourselves, come back to who we started as.
Yeah, I actually think that's what this so-called midlife crisis concept is all about, by the way, as well, where we get to a point in our lives where we might be doing really well, doing really well in my career. I'm getting acknowledged, maybe even held up as a role model in certain ways. But I suddenly discover it's not doing it for me anymore. Something's missing. It's almost like there's this realization that I've lost touch with who I really am. And you sometimes hear it in people's language. I need to find myself. I need to go to India and discover myself, or quit my job and kind of rediscover who I am. And I think it's this realization that, we need to sort of get back in touch with who we were meant to be. rather than, just going to business school to study accountancy because my parents said it was a good idea. So I did that, and it set me off on a career path. It wasn't my choice. It was kind of scripted into it. And my boss said, well, that would be a good career direction for you. So I take it and I go that way. And I'm kind of reacting to external forces as opposed to, what works for me best. What about my own locus of control, in a way. And I think sometimes we get scripted into our lives by external sources, meaning well-meaning sources, but sometimes we can get channeled in a direction that perhaps ultimately we find it's not really who we are in a sense. And perhaps that's where the midlife crisis, which I think is a crisis of identity, actually, who am I really, is the question there. I think that's possibly why that happens.
And also we become scripted into it because we want approval, we want to be liked, we want to be accepted. And
it affects our well-being. I just wanted to bring it back to that sort of concept. If we follow a path that doesn't feel right, it's like walking around with a stone in my shoe. I can walk around in it, but it's irritating. Doesn't feel comfortable, in a way. It sort of damages our well-being, our emotional well-being, our mental well-being, even our physical well-being sometimes, and it can do damage to our relationships because I get snappy with my family members or upset with them too quickly. And, so these different aspects of well-being, I think, start to be affected if we're not sort of, in a way, true to ourselves, as opposed to being inauthentic in a way, doing it because somebody else told me I had to do it, as opposed to aligning with how I was meant to be in a way.
And I think also we deny the world and our close people the opportunity to have the real present version of ourselves. So they get a lukewarm, as you said, a light bulb that's dimmed by all those layers on it, instead of the real version of ourselves, which is a travesty, I think. So I think that's part of the midlife crisis. And maybe it's part of, because that was my last question I wanted to bring to you, is what do you think is the reason that mental health is so challenged in this world today? Can you suggest an answer to that? So many people are really battling with their mental health, and it seems strange because in a way we're living in, relatively speaking, easy times. I know there's endless challenges in terms of the constant challenge for our attention and constant demands and uncertainty. But in reality, we're not in a world war, well, not unless we live somewhere other than the Western world. So why do you think mental health is such a thing at the moment? People are struggling to the degree that they are.
It's a big question, I think, Sue. It's got to do with, I think, pressure in a way. It's linked into stress, I believe. I did in fact, you might have seen it. I kind of wrote a little piece on stress and burnout a little while back, and did a couple of masterclasses on that sort of topic. And when I was kind of doing the research for that, I mean, if you look at all of the global statistics on burnout and stress, it's radically increased over time, and it's continuing to increase. So it implies that something is causing more stress in people's lives, in more people's lives, that affects people's mental health, and I think physical health as well, by the way, and other aspects. It disturbs our whole world, actually, when we get into that sort of space. And I think there's a lot linked into it. I think, even sort of economies and job security, the way people work these days, I can't think of a 9 till 5 job anymore. We don't work in those sort of parameters. We get outcomes we've got to achieve, and we've got to achieve them within a certain deadline. And if that means working 15 hours a day for 6 months, then that's what we do, and So work has taken on a different way of being, gradually over time. As I say, I can't think of a sort of a 9 to 5 job. There's very few of them these days. So I think the pressures of work, I think that the pressures of the economy, things like inflation and affordability and taking care of one's financial situation. There was a time, I suppose, decades and decades ago when, traditional families existed where usually the female version, the mother would stay at home, look after the kids, the dad would go out and work, and one person working in a family would be enough to provide for a family. That's not the case anymore. Most families that I'm aware of, both parents, if it's an intact, both parents present, are working, typically. Children are kind of taken care of elsewhere, and sometimes parents not even raising their kids, other people are, in a sense. So the family units are different from what they used to be. A lot more pressure on families. You're seeing a lot more broken families, around, for all kinds of various reasons. You've got things like social media happening, which is, I suppose, a relatively new phenomenon. The access to information, which very often is information overload, I find. That you put anything into an internet system or a search engine, you'll come up with thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of references to that topic. So we're kind of bombarded with lots of information. A lot of people trying to grab our attention, and all of this, in a way, takes us away from who we are. We're just trying to cope. We're trying to cope with all of this stuff, and keep head above water. And I think that's probably part of it. We lose touch with ourselves. We're just kind of so engaged with treading water, staying alive, staying sort of reasonably okay, without thinking about who am I really, and the kind of conversation we're having here. It just feels like there is so much going on in the world. Even the news, the news is negative pretty much. The newspapers, the TV news, they bombard us with negative information as well about what's going on in the world, which again adds pressure and stress, and people get concerned about that whole thing. In South Africa right now, about the Eskom scenario, the load shedding, the hours and hours every day when we don't have electrical power, having to cope with that reality. We've just come through the whole COVID situation, which added huge stress on a lot of people for various reasons.
Crime.
Loss of life, crime, and. So I think there's just so much going on in the world around us. It's a little bit like a tornado, and we've got to kind of survive in this whole thing. And I think, mental health, emotional health, well-being sometimes pays a price. It takes a back seat.
And so the anecdote in knowing all that, what can people do? I mean, I think one of the things that they can do is to try and come back to themselves, try and use information as this Enneagram and 5 lens view of themselves can help them do, but try and reconnect with who they are in spite of what the world is like.
I think so. Because, what happens is that all of that sort of tornado draws us away from ourselves. We're kind of so focused on what's happening in the world, what's going on, finding out what's happening, etc., hearing what's happening and the negativity. We can get just absorbed with that, and we lose touch with self, I think. So I do think that one of the ways is, and I know you're very focused on well-being, this idea of well-being in a holistic way. Not just mental well-being, but emotional well-being, physical well-being, spiritual well-being. All of this is really significant. So coming back to self again and not losing ourselves in all of this, I think is important. I really do. And I know it's a big part of the work that you do. And it's certainly a big part of the work that we do. And it's about getting people grounded again, getting people to be present, not just, absorbed with this stuff and taken off balance, quite so much, but finding that solid, grounded space, which is about their identity. Who am I really in the middle of all of this? What are the strengths that I have that I can apply, the resources that I have that I can use? What are the non-strengths that I have? And do I need to develop something there? Do I need to grow in certain ways in order to be more comfortable in this space that we're in? So I think being intentional about our own growth and development for me is significant. That helps us cope with life. And there's a lot going on in many people's lives these days. Life is complex. It's not a simple thing.
Yeah. In short, not leaving yourself abandoned in the world while you are attending to everything outside of you. So yeah. Colin, absolutely. We could talk for the next 6 weeks. I would never run out of things to discuss with you, and I love hearing the way that you explain things. I loved hearing how you explained the Enneagram, even after 25 years of working with it. I still learn more whenever I hear someone explain it. And I really, really appreciate your insight, your wisdom, and your time. And I hope that we can have another conversation in a few months' time and take this to a deeper level. But in the meantime,
thanks. It's been great to speak with you again. Great to connect, and lovely conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And how can people get hold of you is what I want to say before we close down, because I'm sure there are going to be some people who are very interested to find out more about the 5 Lens program. Of course, you do need somebody to facilitate your debrief, and I'm available to do that, but so are you. So how would people get in touch with you should they want to do it through you?
Yeah, no, thank you. So probably one of the easiest ways is our website. So we've got a 5 Lens website. It's 5lens.co.za, very simple. 5lens.co.za, 5 Lens, all one word, .co.za. And there's information about the 5 Lens there. There's various articles. There is even opportunities to sign up for our trainings if you wanted to do that. So that would be probably the best place. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Colin. And I wish you a really great rest of the day.
Thank you. And to you as well, Sue. Thank you so much. You too.
All right. Bye for now.
Please push the subscribe button so that you can be alerted when future episodes are available. Thank you for listening.